Alright, so we're going to pick up Chapter 3, going over some other legal issues that we have to be worried about. In order for negligence to be proven, there are two different versions. Is Either way, it's some form of breach of our legal duty. It can either be considered criminal negligence or civil negligence. Um, Criminal negligence is anything that the government would bring up against the EMT, such as by your act the person was killed, severely injured, um, anything that like I said, a federal charge could be brought up with. However, this could potentially involve either years of imprisonment or hefty fines to be placed against you. Either way, you're probably going to lose your license if this happens. Civil negligence, this is when something has happened, some form of wrongdoing or a tort. Usually they're looking for some form of monetary compensation for the damages that were involved. And usually they're claiming some form of injury was caused by to the plaintiff who filed the lawsuit. In order for it to be considered a tort, there had to have been no intent to do harm. So you didn't intentionally try to do this. That's the key. But by your acts, and there was some form of breach of act of there was a breach of duty to act, such as you're on the truck, you were supposed to respond, but you didn't. That would be that breach of duty to act. The patient had to have suffered some harm or injury as a result of that breach of duty. Um, you know, you were pulling the stretcher down the driveway, and you weren't holding onto the stretcher properly, and it tipped over. You are now liable for negligence. However, if the patient was strapped in properly, you were holding the stretcher properly, and the patient started to move after telling them to sit still, now the patient, due to the patient's own act, now that's how they suffered injury. So it can go both ways. You just want to make sure that you have witnesses if needed. Some other legal principles: res ispa loquitur. This comes into play when the caregiver's actions are the cause of the patient's harm, such as because of your care, the patient got injured more. Negligence per se means that an act is considered to be negligent simply because it is in violation of a statute or regulation such as written EMS protocols or approved scope of practice. Such as, for example, a paramedic losing their license because they didn't recertify. So now they're having to work as a basic, and they go to a patient, and this medic starts an IV line. That is outside of their scope of practice, so they could be charged with negligence. Some other types of torts that we could be charged with is abandonment, assault and battery, defamation, whether it's slander or libel. Um, Slander is some form of verbal defamation, so me saying someone is drunk when they're actually not. And libel is me actually writing something down that is not true and putting it out that way. That is harmful to a person's name or reputation. Assault and battery, this term gets mixed up quite often. Assault is actually verbal. So if somebody is being verbally abusive towards somebody and stating that if you don't, for example, in our realm, if you don't calm down, I'm going to strap you to the stretcher, that could be assault. However, if I hit somebody, I could be charged with battery. Okay? A lot of times some people think if I hit somebody I'm being charged with assault. No. If I hit somebody, I'm actually being charged with battery. Assault is verbal, battery is the physical version. Intentional torts, the main difference is when there you did not meet the standard of care. That would be negligence. Let's say you just you didn't realize that you had done it. Okay? Intentional tort is when you knowingly commit something. That would be your false imprisonments, your defamations, assault and battery. You know you did it, whereas the negligence is you didn't mean to do something. There are times when we may have to transfer care to a flight crew. Such as we have a critical patient who was involved in a motor vehicle accident, we're needing to life flight them out. So we want to make sure that if you ever do this, that you can only transfer care of a patient to somebody of equal or greater training in order to avoid charges of abandonment. So me as a medic, I can only transfer care to either another paramedic or a nurse or physician. Basic, you can transfer to basic, a basic to a basic, advanced paramedic, or so on and so forth. Okay, so always be aware of who you're transferring care to. Confidentiality, we do not speak to the press, family, friends, or anybody about any details of any care that we provide to our patient. In order for the information to be released, there has to be some form of written agreement signed by the patient or the guardian releasing that information. Um, sometimes it's easy. We get home, we had a bad day at work, we want to talk to our family about it. Sometimes we can't. A lot of the times we can't because we may be seeing people that we grew up with, somebody that our family may know, um, and they come up to us and say, Sally Sue got into an accident the other day. Do you know what happened? I can't talk to you about it. I'm sorry. Alright? That can be hard to deal with, but we cannot. That is, our patients have that right of confidentiality, and we have to provide that to them all the time. However, we can release the information if needed to continue medical care. So when we arrive to the hospital and we're transferring care over, we are allowed to release that information to those who are uh, permitted, such as the nurse reporting to physician taking over care, so on and so forth. Mandatory reporting laws, what would that be considered under? What would be required, mandated for us to report? Right. Sexual abuses, potential rapes, elderly or child abuse, that would be required for us to report. Um, if we are subpoenaed, we have to release information. Our insurance companies or whoever we are billing, there is certain information that we have to provide them so we can make sure that we are billing our patients properly so we can get funded. HIPAA, this was enacted in 1996. This is a federal law that protects patients' privacy of their healthcare information and gives the patient control over how that information is distributed. These are very strict. It covers everything from how records are maintained, how they are stored, accessed, how they are to be discussed. It covers all of that. If you violate these, there are hefty fines that come along with them. There has to be some form of medical necessity in order for us to relay this information. We do receive training on it every so often within your agency, and this has to be maintained. If you do not get the HIPAA training and something happens, not only can you get in trouble, but your agency get in trouble as well. COBRA and EMTALA, these are federal regulations that ensure that a patient has access to emergency care, whether or not they are able to pay. all hospitals that accept Medicare and Medicaid, if a patient comes on scene or comes into their facility, they have to provide a stabilization of the patient and initial treatment. And if treatment is unable to be maintained there, they have to transport them out to an appropriate facility. How we're involved with it is when we are transferring a patient from a hospital to another medical facility. Like I said, the ones that have to be stabilized and then transferred out. And we need to make sure that if we have a patient, a critical patient, that needs to be stabilized outside of what we are capable of, that we take them to the best appropriate medical facility. So, let's say I'm in Ozark. That's my primary part-time job. That's where I worked full-time before here. If I have a patient who's having a myocardial infarction or a heart attack or a stroke, Dell Medical Center, while they would be great at providing, they would be able to provide a high quality treatment, they cannot do the cath that patient would ultimately need. So I would actually bypass that patient because pending I'm able to handle them, they're not more critical than what I can handle. I will bypass Dale DMC and take them straight to Southeast or to Flowers, depending on which one would be most appropriate. So you want to make sure that you are qualified and capable of handling that patient before you try to ever make that decision. Because if not, you can get in trouble, but you're now violating EMTALA. Whenever doing any kind of transfer, you want to make sure that you have certification from the physician. This will be done through a PCS statement. It just states, why is the patient needing to be transported? What are they being transported on? Who's the receiving physician? All that information has to be established prior to transfer. A bed has to be ready for that patient. Make sure that you are providing the level of care necessary for that transport. Sometimes the hospitals, or it doesn't always get dispatched out properly. So there's been times before I got my medical license, they paged out a transport and all they said was IVO2 and normal saline, which as an advanced EMT, I can transport that. However, when I arrived, the patient was on a ventilator, they were on multiple drips, stuff that was outside of my scope of practice. So I could not transport that patient because otherwise I'd be violating EMTALA. So we called another crew and they came in and took that transport. And you want to make sure that you take the quickest route possible. Don't take the back roads because if otherwise you'll be in violation of EMTALA and insurance normally won't pay. Patients that could potentially be an organ donor, we should not treat them any different. If they are in cardiac arrest, we treat them just like we would any other cardiac arrest. If they're having a stroke or a heart attack, we treat them like every other patient, whether they are an organ donor or not. Just because somebody has the organ donor marker on their driver's license, that is not uh, that just says that, hey, I want to be an organ donor. There still has to be documentation of it signed once they arrive or once they get to the hospital. There are some medical bracelets that you can see. If you see these type of bracelets, you may see them on their wrists. They may have them hanging around their neck. Um, it'll say medical alert, whatever. Make sure you check it and see exactly what it's for. It could be the patient could be a diabetic, could be an allergy. Make sure that you look at it properly. It may say, hey, uh, card or check wallet. They may have an identification card in their wallet, and it can have their medications, their medical history, any allergies, all that information. So you want to be cognizant and look for these. Tattoos, these aren't fully accepted yet, and the reason being is it because they truly have it? Could it be overlooked? Um, There was a case where a patient had DNR tattooed across his chest, and he went into cardiac arrest. And when they exposed his chest, they see this tattoo that states DNR straight flat across his chest, and you know they had to make a choice. Is this a uh, is the patient stating that he wants to be doesn't want anything done, or is this someone's initials? Which, come to find out, it was someone's initials, and had they not done the resuscitative efforts, they would could have potentially gotten in trouble for that. We want to make sure that we can recognize death in the field. If the patient is still warm to the touch, but they do not exhibit any obvious signs of death, such as decapitation, they've already started to decompose, rigor mortis hasn't set in, or when the limbs becoming stiff, those are not obvious signs of death. So if they are warm and there's no lividity or anything like that, we start resuscitative efforts. However, if their patient is hypothermic, such as laying out in the snow and they became hypothermic, you want to start working the patient, because there have been cases where that happened, and when they warmed the patient back up, patient regained a pulse and was able to continue, or actually got discharged from the hospital and lived on after that. For patients with an advance directive, if they are absent of a pulse, no blood pressure, no pupillary response, we are to recognize that as obvious death, call medical control, and get a time of death, have the PD involved, so that way they can get the coroner out there as well. With no advance directive, if they have decapitated or been decapitated, their body's starting to decompose or depend on lividity, or they have mottling starting to form, that's how we can those are our obvious signs of death in the field, which would not require us to begin any type of resuscitative effort. If there's any suspicion of a homicide or suicide of the patient, any crash-related death, SIDS, unusual scenes, anything like that, we do need to call the coroner out there to investigate, because it may be something that it requires a forensics case and the body to be sent off for examination. If we arrive on scene of a crime scene, ultimately your first concern is safety. Safety is always your number one concern wherever you are at. However, usually, let me backtrack. If it is a crime scene, usually the police have already gotten there. However, sometimes we may pull up on something that may not have came out that would indicate it. So we may actually be the first ones there. If you get there and something doesn't feel right, your bat senses are going off, whatever, just call for PD to come out there. If you need to, get back in the trucks and pull away until PD arrives to clear the scene. If you're ever in that situation, wait until the police has cleared the scene. Even if they've declared the scene safe, it can still be potentially dangerous, because you don't know if if it was an assault, is emotions are running high, people are upset, another fight could potentially break out. If there's any potential evidence, don't disturb it. Make a trail going in and out and follow that way. Don't walk around anywhere else. Um, if you have to touch anything, only touch what you have to, and if you move it, let an officer know. For example, you're trying to provide care to the patient who just shot themselves because they still have a pulse, and you need to move the gun. Let the officer know that you're needing to move it, so that way they can document it. Don't use the phone, because now your DNA is on it, your fingerprints are on it, and the person you called is on that line, and they're going to document. you're gonna have to get your fingerprints checked and get cleared from it. And the person you called cleared from it. And just don't do it. Okay, save yourself that hassle. If you're unable to get police permission to do anything, don't move the patient unless you have to provide care to anybody. If there's any holes in the clothing, such as patient got stabbed or bullet holes or anything along those lines, don't cut through them. Cut around the holes so that way you can preserve any potential evidence. If the patient hung themselves, don't cut through the knot or tie. They'll actually look at that, because if it's a murder case, they're going to look at the knot and see if they can use that for looking for DNA or anything along that. Don't cover the patient with a sheet, because that'll just absorb any bodily fluids. If the victim was raped, do not allow them to wash themselves or to wash their clothing, because then they're just ultimately washing any DNA down the sink. Don't let them use the bathroom. Don't let them take anything by mouth. Um, and it's going to be hard, but unfortunately we have to. So that way we can try to get them to the hospital and get them the treatment that they need and potentially catch the perpetrator that did that to them. If there's any abuse, crime, or injuries related to drugs, we do have to report them to the police, um, pending they want to. Now, if it's a crime, such as someone got shot, we do have to call them in. If somebody got raped, they do have the right to not go through it, but we just make sure you know what the requirements of your state are, um, on whether or not you'd have to report those to the police. I know in Alabama, any attempted suicides or dog bites, we do have to report to the state. Um, if someone is raped, they do have a right to get treatment, but not get the police involved. But at any time, they can change that decision to get police involvement. Safe haven laws. These are designed to prevent child abandonment. If a parent decides that they do not want custody of an infant, they can give that to proper authority. We are allowed to do that. If someone shows up and they say, "Take my baby," you know, I don't want them anymore. We can't. We're not supposed to ask any questions, ask any details. Obviously, we can ask what the baby's name is, what the date of birth is, so that way we have that information. But we don't ask the parent what their name is or anything like that, because they are relinquishing custody of that child. It's just like them giving them up for adoption. They cannot. They're like, "I'm done." Okay, we take the child, call PD, DHS. If the patient needs, take them to the hospital, make sure that the child is okay, give them any treatment that they may need, and get them into the system so that way they could potentially get a new home. Alright, that is chapter 3. If you have any questions, just shoot me a message in Blackboard or just ask me the next time that we are in class together. Other than that, I will see y'all in class.